As a documentary cinematographer, keeping your footage in focus is an incredibly important part of the job. But I'm going to let you in on a little secret. You don't need autofocus. You don't need a follow focus. You don't need a bunch of accessories to keep the shot sharp. I know, but you might be thinking autofocus has come so far, and aren't these focus contraptions what's going to allow me to make those subtle adjustments? Don't let camera companies tell you that. Don't let influencers tell you that. What you need to do is learn to trust your instincts and take back your creative control. Afraid of having a soft image from time to time if you have to do it yourself? Don't be. I'm here to give you some tips on how to pull your own focus without the help of technology, just by putting your hand on the lens and directing the audience to exactly what you want them to look at the exact moment that you want them to, without anybody knowing that it's happening. When I'm filming a scene, I want to be in total control of what the camera's doing. I want to dictate when I shift focus from one person to another and at what speed. Because remember, everything that we're doing in docs really only happens once and is generally unpredictable. We don't get to rehearse, we don't take marks, so why would you rely on the camera to make those decisions? What happens when you're in a crowded space, right? Who's the camera going to choose to focus on? And is it going to decide to hold it all the way through, or is it randomly going to change the focus when someone's head turns? And then you add shooting wide open to that equation, and good luck getting a usable shot. And even the best autofocus can have trouble in low light or low contrast scenes, and then it's just going to cause that dreaded fishing focus look. Okay, so hopefully you haven't just put the camera in autofocus to let it do its thing. But you might be thinking, let's just use autofocus to track this one person, right? You're shooting on a gimbal. You're shooting an interview. And yes, this is probably going to work well in certain situations, but I can also tell you from experience that autofocus, like anything else that's automated, is going to choose the exact wrong time to fail. And it's going to ruin a shot that there's a good chance you're not going to be able to do again. And on top of that, it's also going to make you look like you don't know what you're doing. And then there's the obvious advantage of being able to use lenses that don't have autofocus, right? You can use cinema lenses, vintage lenses, older photo lenses. None of these are going to have autofocus. And while you might not be shooting on them right now, I'd assume at some point you'd want to, right? Because they can give your film a lot more creative options, as well as setting yourself up to be more successful in the business. So why not learn how to focus them now? It sounds funny, but sometimes things are just easier when you do it yourself. And I've talked a lot about removing variables from the equation, right? Doing whatever you can to make your connection with the camera and the story stronger. And turning off autofocus is at the top of this list. With practice and a few tips, you can pull off any focus move you want on any lens exactly how you want. The first step to pulling your own focus is just understanding how the mechanics work so that you can better control it. And the main thing to be aware of with this is the focus rotation distance. And that's basically how far it takes the rotation to get from minimum focus to infinity. And that's going to be measured in degrees. So on still lenses, especially modern ones, the focus ring is going to be somewhere in the 90 to 100 degree focus rotation. And what you're also going to find on these lenses is oftentimes the focus ring has no hard stops. So what this means is that the ring is just going to continue to spin even after you hit minimum focus or infinity. So that's just something that you're going to have to keep in mind. So ultimately, with this 90 to 100 degree focus rotation, what that means is that just with a slight turn of the focus ring, you're going to have a considerable effect on your focus distance. Now, on the other hand, if you take something like a cinema zoom, and I've got the Ingenue EZ zoom here, these lenses are going to have a focus rotation of 300 degrees. This is great when you want subtle control of your focus over a short distance, but it can be a little difficult when you're needing to do a significant focus rack. So if you take something like the Canon 17-120, a broadcast style lens that's used a lot in docs, it's going to sit right in the middle with a focus rotation of 180 degrees. So ultimately, all this means is that you just need to get comfortable with the lens that you're using and know how much of a turn it takes to get from one focus distance to another. The other thing to know is that the rotation moves exponentially. So if you look at the focus marks on your lens, there's a lot more rotation that's required on the close end of the focus range than there is on the long end. So if we use my easy zoom as an example, then you're going to see the first half of the rotation, so about 180 degrees, is only going to get me to about 3.5 feet. And then the other half of the rotation is going to take me the rest of it, so from 3.5 feet all the way to infinity. So what that means is that when you're making focus adjustments on the close end of the lens, then you're going to have to turn the focus ring a lot further than you would if you were focusing from, say, 10 feet to 40 feet. Really, the only way to get comfortable with these two factors of the focus rotation and the exponential focus change is practice. And even though it sounds complicated, it's actually a lot easier than it sounds. And I promise that once you start practicing this, you're going to get the hang of it. So just take your camera out and turn off the autofocus and give it a try. And once you've gotten familiar doing it on one lens, try putting on a different lens with a different focus rotation and see how that feels. It'll take a minute to warm up to the longer or shorter throw, but again, I think that your brain and your hands will compensate. The key is just to slow down and remember the exponential nature of the focus, and know that if you're filming something further away, it's not going to take that much of a turn to make a considerable focus change. And again, if you're closer to your subject, then it's going to take a slightly longer rotation to get to where you need to go. So just slow down and refrain from making jerky, quick moves with your focus. And that's going to really just keep things looking a lot smoother. It's going to keep your editor happy, and it's going to keep your audience happy. And if you slightly buzz the focus, it's fine. Just wait for the right moment to bring it into focus. Because the audience is only going to criticize when you miss the focus if you abruptly draw their attention to it with making a quick or jerky correction. And trust me, having a slightly out of focus shot that comes into focus on a move or a pause or something that feels right, then it's going to look a lot better than autofocus trying to make that correction for you. Okay, so you're starting to get a feel for pulling your own focus and not having the camera do it for you. So now you're probably thinking, now's the perfect time to put my follow focus on, right? Wrong. Here's another classic example of manufacturers and influencers making you think that you need a follow focus or a motorized focus controller. The purpose of a follow focus is for your focus puller to be able to sit at the side of the camera and control the focus while somebody else is operating. It's really not going to help you if you're pulling your own focus from behind the camera. Really, the only time that I ever use a follow focus is if I'm shooting a really long interview, or if I've got a longer lens that's just physically longer. Then putting the follow focus on that can make it a little bit more comfortable to grab if I'm sitting at the camera for a long period of time. But it really isn't going to help you if you're shooting handheld. So I would say just get rid of it. The same goes for a motorized focus controller, something like a tilt-a-nucleus. Now, don't get me wrong, they're great, and I have one, but they really have a specific purpose of when it makes sense to use them, and shooting handheld really isn't one of them. It's great for pulling focus remotely when your camera's on a gimbal or a jib or somewhere that you can't physically touch the lens, but it's really not going to help you when you're shooting handheld. And I'm not telling you all of this just because I'm a purist in how I like to operate. A follow focus, especially the ones that most of us can afford, are going to have a lot of play in the gear. So what this means is if you're trying to make subtle adjustments, which is a lot of pulling your own focus in documentaries, is the gear's not going to move when you first start to turn the handle. It's basically going to have a little bit of a lag between the first turn and the gear starting to turn and engage on the lens. So this is going to cause a lot of frustrations when you're shooting. And again, the last thing that we want is something getting in the way of us trying to do what it is that we need to do. And comfortably mounting a follow focus means that it's going to be in your face. It's going to block access to other important elements like the iris on the lens. And it's really just adding bulk and weight that isn't necessary. When it comes to using motors and hand grips like the tilt-a-nucleus, the finger wheels on those have an incredibly short focus throw. It's going to be impossible. You're going to blow your focus all of the time. And again, all of these added elements are just that. All they're doing is achieving the same thing that's going to happen if you have your hand on the lens, but it's going to add more bulk, more weight, and more places for things to go wrong. So if you have two hand grips to operate and you're pulling your own focus, what happens when you have to move your left hand off of that hand grip to make a focus change, which is going to happen all of the time? Because remember, pulling your own focus is a constant thing. And you can't really just set your focus and forget it, move your hand back to the hand grip, and then bring your hand up and focus again. People are constantly leaning in and out. People are shifting. There really is no, purely static moment when it comes to focus. And so, don't keep your hand on that hand grip all the time, as opposed to just keeping it on the lens when you're able to constantly make those adjustments as people are leaning forward, are making those subtle changes. And you can then start to just kind of move with them, right? Ultimately, having your hand on the lens is going to be the easiest way to connect with the focus. Because as you move, your hand moves. And then the whole operation becomes one, and it's very quickly second nature. So especially when you're shooting docs, you're going to want that camera to be an extension of your body. And here's what I use on my camera, right? It's a right hand grip that has good stabilization, but then on the left side is I have this wooden ball. And what this does is it allows me to rest my palm on it, and it keeps my fingers free to operate, the focus or the zoom on the lens. And when I shoot, generally I'll keep one finger on the focus and one on the zoom, so that I'm able to constantly make those adjustments as I go. And what I'll do is I'll then just align the position of this on the rods of the camera so that the ball grip is sitting right at the focus ring. And that way I always know exactly where the focus is, and I'm not having to fish up and down the lens to find the focus. Now that we've been through a bunch of the mechanics of the lens, I think now we have to figure out how we're going to actually keep it sharp. And the first thing is going to be peaking. So focus peaking is going to be essential when you're trying to find good focus on your shot, especially as the resolutions get higher and higher. And peaking is going to come in a variety of colors that's going to make it really obvious when things are sharp. So I think starting out, it's a good idea to choose a color that really stands out, like red. Because when you do come into focus, you're going to know right away. But when I shoot, I don't actually use a color. What I found is that having a color to the peaking is actually going to make it difficult for me to judge the other critical elements of shooting, like exposure and color balance. So I'll use white. And basically what that's doing is effectively just upping the contrast of the image. Well, it's still letting me see if my white balance is good, if my exposure is looking right. It's really just going to crisp up the image without having any other kind of influence on the color or the brightness of the shot. One of the caveats of using white as your peaking color is it can start to play tricks with your eyes. If you feel like the best thing to do is just to take all of those peaking thresholds and crank them to their highest level to make things easier to focus, what ultimately is going to end up happening is it's actually going to have an effect on the perceived brightness of your shot. Once those settings get higher and that whiteness becomes more pronounced, your shot's going to look brighter than it actually is in your monitor or your viewfinder. And what that can do is it can ultimately have you underexposing your shot. So obviously this isn't going to become as much of a problem if you're using a color on your peaking, because you're going to be able to see that increased sharpness happening as a red or a green or a blue as opposed to white. So, if you're going to use white, which again, to me is going to be the best way to make sure that I am maintaining my proper exposure and my white balance, is just find a good setting that's sitting somewhere in the middle that is really just, again, kind of having an increase in sharpness and an slight increase in contrast to know when things pop into sharp focus. Another helpful tip is just finding reference marks in the room. So when you first walk into a space, just look around and start to get a sense of the depth. Find things in the room that might be where somebody would land and focus to that and really see what does the focus pull feel like when going from, if somebody's standing over here next to that chair, focus to the chair, and then they walk over to the sofa. So now pull to the sofa and just get a sense of what that focus pull feels like. And then you can really start to kind of, predict and have a feeling of what you need to pull from one place to another as people move through the space. The other thing that I would say with this is you don't always have to shoot everything wide open, because obviously shooting wide open is going to make keeping everything in focus at all times a lot more difficult. When you're shooting wide open handheld, to me, it's a little disorienting. Obviously to each their own. But when I'm shooting documentaries, especially when I'm shooting verite, is I tend to like to live in around the T4 space, because it is going to have, a shallow enough depth of field that I'm able to separate the person that I'm focusing on from the background. But it's also not going to make the background so soft that it becomes just a blur, because I feel like, at least in documentaries, the environment plays as much of a character as the person does. And so, certainly there are places and times that it makes sense to shoot wide open. But when you're shooting handheld, try to just have a little bit of a deeper stop. This is, to me, not only going to make just for a better looking image, but it's also going to help tremendously when you're trying to keep things in focus. Another tip is learn the nuances of people's body language. Because the more time that you spend with people on camera, the more you're going to pick up how they move. So for instance, a lot of times people are going to either lean forward or lean back when they're about to say something. But you'll almost always move back to their resting position once they start talking. So you can start to anticipate when this focus shift is going to happen purely based off of people's body language. So start to get to know that. And, again, by keeping your hand on the lens and on the focus ring at all times, is you can really start to breathe with them. You can start to move with them in a much more natural way. And lastly, the most important tip is just practice. The only way that you're going to get good at anything is by doing it over and over again. And focusing is no different. But with time, all of this stuff is going to become second nature, and you really can't imagine using anything else. By removing all of the unnecessary elements from the equation, you can really start to take back the creative control of your image. You can choose exactly what's in focus and when, without having to worry about what the camera's thinking. Removing layers of complexity is going to allow you the mental bandwidth to be able to be in the moment and translate that moment effectively through focus. I hope this video was helpful and gave you some good tips as you start to work on your manual focus techniques. Thank you so much for watching, and I look forward to seeing you on the next one.